Okay, so first of all, I want to congratulate the consortium, and it's tremendous to have this kind of meeting with so many people, and it's an honor for me to be invited to talk and also to have the opportunity to explain our project. As most of you know, I had been usually participating in computing in cardiology as a researcher, and in 2019 we finally make the jump to try to move our technology and our advances in research to something that could really become a clinically useful device. And since companies, industry were not calling to our doors, we had to move on to set up our own startup. And today I will try to talk about what we learned from the clinical point of view. So which were the problems that we were trying to solve with our research, and how we plan to move it on to become a really device that really could help the people. And first, as I mentioned, I'm the co-founder of this company. So what I'm talking about will be about something that we are doing. And the first question of my talk is, which needs to be the challenges in which ECGI can be useful in clinics? So how we could ensure that this kind of technology become clinically useful? And one of the questions that happens is that in research, we are always focused, and almost mandatorily focused, in trying to find the fanciest application for our technology. We need to find the most beautiful paper with the most beautiful pictures, with the most strange patients, and all this is great. We enjoy it a lot, but the truth is that once we come back to the hospital, we used to cross this kind of corridors in which there are tens of patients in the waiting room trying to be visited by a clinician in less than 10 minutes and get a good treatment. And it's difficult to be sure that all what we are developing in the ECGI, all these kind of fancy technologies, be useful for all these kind of patients. And how we could do it, which is the main challenge from my point of view of ECGI. And one of the things is that, and this is not my sentence, but we should not try to make amazing the ECGI. We should try to be sure that it is useful in the day-by-day clinical practice. And this is one of the things that sometimes we forgot. So it's necessary to be sure that our technology solves the problems that the clinicians have in the day-by-day practice. Because when can it be useful? As it's well explained in the web of the consortium, ECGI can be useful helping during diagnosis process. ECGI can be useful helping during therapeutic process. And in many pathologies, it can help in the atrial arrhythmias, it can help trying to improve, for example, the resynchronization therapies, or detecting foggy ventricular topics. I will focus my talk in the atrial fibrillation because it's true that this is where my research and most of what we have been doing have been working, but this something will be similar in the other things. Here, I will try to explain which is the clinical flowchart of all patients with atrial fibrillation, and where ECGI could help to improve both diagnosis and treatment. At least in hospitals, one of our hospitals that we more work, which is the Gregorio Marañón in Madrid. I have been 8 years working there, and every year we have 10,000 new patients with atrial fibrillation, almost, well, some years even more. From those, only 1/4 of them, 2,500, are really visited by an electrophysiologist. So these 10,000, most of the time, are visited by a regular cardiologist or even by a regular clinician that says, okay, there is nothing to do with your AF for whatever reason. But the truth is that who selects which patients go to the electrophysiologist and which are the criterion that they use is highly dependent on the clinician. There are no clear rules. There are no clear techniques to know, okay, the atrial fibrillation of this patient can be restored to sinus rhythm or it cannot. So the clinician decides. But the next step also happens. At least in a hospital, we only make around 400 ablations per year. That means that the treatment that has a better success, which is supposed to be atrial ablation, only is applied to less than 4% of the total number of patients with atrial fibrillation. And which is the worst? These ablations, between 30 and 50% of time, need to be repeated or failed. So we have 3 clear points in which we need some help to identify which are the optimal patients to go to the electrophysiologist, which are the optimal patients to go to the ablation room, and which is the optimal procedure that we should to follow during the ablation procedure. These are the three. And then the question is, how can ECGI be useful in those three problems? Or it can or it cannot. And I want to point that, for example, in the guidelines of this year of atrial fibrillation from the European Society, explicitly explain the need of more stratification tools, better tools for mapping and for selecting the treatment. Okay, let's compare what is already in the clinics, what is used every single day. On one hand, we have the regular ECG, and in the other hand, we have intracardiac mapping techniques. ECGI has some advantages and some inconveniences, disadvantages, both days. Of course, compared with the ECG, we have better mapping, we can provide information regarding space, more accuracy, but we are much more complex to get. So an ECG can be recorded in 10 minutes. An ECGI right now with CT and MRI scans is difficult to get it in less than 2 hours. So it's difficult to try to compare with that in that aspect. And what happens with the other step, the intracardiac mapping? Of course, we have a great advantage in there, non-invasive. So we can be performed without the need of introducing a catheter. And another important advantage, ECGI can map the entire atria, or entire ventricles, at least the epicardium, globally. So even where catheters cannot go or where you cannot make it, you need to be step by step, ECGI can do it. But it's true that we need to be realistic. We will not be able to have the same kind of accuracy that intracardiac map has. If you are there, you are touching, probably you will get better accuracy than what we get from outside. But of course, there is a gap in between. So an ECGI should try, at least in my view, should try to focus in those problems, specific problems in which ECG is not enough, but intracardiac mapping is not needed. So there is this kind of gap. And if we go to find the gaps in the diagnosis, not in the technology, but in the procedure, again, for atrial fibrillation, there are many new devices trying to provide better diagnosis tools, and there are many, many treatments. There are many drugs. There are many ablation strategies, many fancy and great catheters, but it's really difficult if you are in the clinics, try to decide which patient will go for a specific drug, which patient will go for a pulmonary vein isolation alone, or which patient will require a high mapping technology to identify drivers outside pulmonary veins. The only way that today, at least in our hands, it works is jumping from one procedure to another procedure. So which are the gaps? So we need some kind of technology, or clinicians, I think they need some kind of technology to decide when to try rhythm control, when to try arrhythmic drugs and which kind of drug, when to define which kind of ablation. And could the ECGI try to answer those questions is one of the things that we have been trying to answer in the last years. And the truth is that I think it can. So if we go to the diagnosis room and we can see there, if there is any kind of information that the ECGI could provide to clinicians before deciding the treatment, before deciding if antiarrhythmic drugs, or even before deciding that ablation could be, we can see something. Let me show you, for example, 2 examples. Here we have a map from ECGI in a patient, which is theoretically was a persistent AF patient. But when we see the map, we clearly see stable reentries, quite simple maps, reproducible maps that are almost all the time there. There was a perfect candidate for an isolation of drivers and stop the arrhythmia. In fact, it happens. But there are some other patients, in which what you observe from the ECGI is quite chaotic maps, really difficult to identify stable drivers, really difficult to see reproducibility in the process. So there is a kind of, let's call it complex AF or simple AF, or at least different kinds of pathology. We cannot say that the same procedure will work in both patients. And this is some information that right now, the only way to get it in the clinical practice is using ECGI. Otherwise, you need to introduce catheters into the patients. So this is clearly something that could be useful. And in fact, when we have analyzed it systematically, we have realized, and we are not the first, other teams have already done, that those patients in which you identify a lower number of stable drivers are those in which the ablation procedures has higher probability of success. Whereas in those patients in which the number of reentries was higher, it's much lower the probability of success of the ablation. And in fact, it is not correlated with the fact that the atrial fibrillation is paroxysmal or persistent. So there is some kind of information in there that ECGI can provide. And moving into the EP lab, not only in the visit room, but in the EP lab, we already know thanks to our colleagues from Medtronic and the great work that they performed a few years ago, that ablation guided by drivers obtained from ECGI can improve the success of the ablation, of the success rates. And not only that, recently we have also demonstrated that those non-invasive mappings have a quite good correlation with invasive mapping. We performed catheters inside and we make simultaneous non-invasive mapping and we obtain similar maps. And which is even more interesting, the catheters, despite they were quite big catheters, I don't know if you can see it, they were not able to map all regions of the atria. There are, here in blue, you can see those regions in which the catheters were not able to go to map them. And thanks to ECGI, we were able to identify in some patients that sometimes the drivers were in those regions outside the area in which the catheter were mapping. So we can provide guidelines of where to place the catheter from the ECGI. And this is something that can be used inside. And this is one of the main advantages because ECGI can non-invasively map both atrias, simultaneously. We can, during a procedure, try to make several maps. Here, for example, you have a patient in which we map it 1 week before the procedure, and we identify drivers in one region or in another region in the atria. In the day of the procedure, at the beginning of, we had the system placed it during the entire procedure, and we were repeating the maps. It's quite fast. Once you have the matrix, when you have everything calculated, it's quite fast to make many, many maps. And you notice that at the beginning you had this, after the isolation of pulmonary veins, this was the protocols, the drivers in the pulmonary veins disappears, but no those drivers in the right atrium. After the isolation of the drivers in the right atrium, you see how those changed to a flutter-like, close to the valve, and finally the procedure finish. This is something that this kind of maps can be done almost instantaneously. We do not need to remap sequentially like in many, many intracardiac mapping. So these are clear advantages of non-invasive mapping. So at least from my point of view, I always like to use this kind of metaphor. So if you think in a catheter, it's like you have a thermometer. All of us around the world can have a thermometer in our house and we will know exactly which is the temperature here. But ECGI is like the satellite. So it's those satellites that is telling me that in 1 week from now, I will have a storm, or which is the pattern and where are mainly the main storms. So the ECGI can provide one information that probably this kind of catheters will not be able to provide, this kind of global mapping. So then all this seems that ECGI can be useful. So why it is not used regularly in all patients? Because at least in our hands, it's quite difficult to use it, the standard ECGI, in all patients. And let's try to see how we usually make ECGI. So we place the electrodes. We have to put the patients into an imaging technology, an MRI or a CT scan. And then we have to segment the geometries of the thorax or the heart and record the signals. And all that is when we can finally run the algorithms to calculate the activity inside the heart. All this process, which has been already demonstrated to be has a high accuracy. The problem is that it has a big clinical bottleneck. We require at least two departments in the hospital, cardiology and radiology, at least in Spain and some other countries. That means that you require at least 2 persons involved in the process, one in one department and one in the other department. And you need to put all together, hopefully the same day, just before the ablation, if you want to use the device during the ablation. So, or at least if you have to start with all this process, you need to start at 7 in the morning to be able to start the ablation procedure, maybe at 9 or at 10. So it's, despite the research process, at least in our hands, it's almost impossible to do. So we were thinking a lot. What could we do? How can we make use of this kind of technology in all patients? And in addition, not only in that 4% of patients that go to the ablation, but in all the other 96% of patients, in that a large amount of patients that require a map before deciding if going or not to the EP lab. And what we think is, okay, which is the main need that we will require? So we require the geometry. we will require to try to be a standalone system. We do not want to need to the radiology, we do not need the MRI, and we want to put the electrodes and in the same room without moving the patient in less than 30 minutes have a result. For that, we need the thorax, of course, and the place of the electrodes, and we need the atrial model, how to put, or the ventricle model, how to put the heart inside there. And we have been working a lot and having some good ideas, some bad ideas, testing a lot, failing a lot, but now we have something that seems to work. What we do, and this is what the prototypes are doing, and now in the final product, ACORYS will be working at that, is we put the electrodes, and with a 3D camera, we reconstruct the geometry of the patient, bedside. The signals, the images are good enough to automatically mix different views on top, on the bottom, the patient move it, and detect where the electrodes are. So we can automatically, in a few minutes, or depending, even seconds sometimes, have the geometry of the thorax. This is, to some extent, the easy part. But what we do to know how to play, which is the geometry of the heart, and how to place that geometry inside the thorax, specifically in the place where it should be. We have been trying a lot of things, trying to use echocardiography, trying to use other kind of simple, easy to use imaging techniques with less and more success. And one of the things that we are using is the fact that we realize that when you solve the ECGI, depending on the algorithm, but usually we use the L curve, which is telling us which is the optimal regularization parameter. And what we realize is that if you have the geometry of the heart in a place which is specifically the optimal place, the curvature of this L curve is higher than when you make an error, when you place the heart in another position. Why did it happen? Basically, because if you do not have the geometry.
Could you speed up a little bit? You're already a bit over time. But...
So sorry, I'm finishing in 2 slides. So basically, I will skip all the process on that. But basically, we use that. We use the curvature of the curve, and from that we iteratively decide where the atria is, solving several times the ECGI, trying to identify the optimal curve in that, and trying to find which is the optimal position of the atria. We change the geometry, we increase the size, we reduce the size, we optimize it, and finally we get a geometry, and we have compared that geometry with both the MRI and the CT scans and the electroanatomic navigator, obtaining similar errors than are obtained between, for example, the electroanatomic imaging and the MRI. And I will skip it, but basically we have also measured something which is the clinically useful thing, which are the metrics. So where the drivers are, which are the values of the drivers, how stable they are. And what we have obtained is that with this methodology, we can get results which are comparable, at least as good as the ones that we get when we use the image technology. So this is how finally we do it. And I will skip it, but basically we are convinced that the ECG needs to be useful to be clinically implanted. And for that, it needs to be cost efficient. That means that of course we need a high quality, but it needs to be on time. So we cannot have the possibility to spend 2 hours or 2 hours and a half for each patient. And the CTI MRI free system can be one solution for that. And finally, this is we are convinced that like it happened during the beginning of this century, that if you may remember at that time, electroanatomic navigators were highly discussed as toys or tools. There was a lot of time lost discussing if we could or not use that. And right now they are needed. So there must always all procedures. So I think as a patient in 20 or 50 or 30 years from now, you have an AF, I want to be sure that I have a non-invasive map before deciding if I need or not go to the ablation room. So I think it will be useful. So thank you for all of you for this time and for letting me explain this process. This is a big work from the team in CORIFY, but also the team in the university, and also all the sponsors who are helping us to move this research into the clinical lab. Thank you very much.